Great. Thanks, Marguerite, and hello, everyone. AgEcon, the company I'm with, we worked on the case studies and the final evaluation of the MPfN. And so what I'm going to do is talk through just the final evaluation part, and specifically, so we looked at the delivery of plans, the effectiveness of the delivery of the program against its plans, delivery against its objectives, and delivery against the immediate and legacy impact of the program in improving NUE practices across the different industries. So I'm going to focus, as Marguerite said, on those last 2 points. So looking at the the impact, sort of immediate and legacy impact that the program has had, and some of the findings that we had there. So first of all, with the objectives, I'm going to talk about them in two different levels. So I'm going to talk about them as the research level objectives, and then I'll talk about the industry level objectives. And I think that's an important distinction, given that this was fundamentally a research project. So looking at those research level objectives separately. So across the program, the perceived level of effectiveness against the research level outcomes, and they were knowledge and understanding and fostering collaboration, research collaboration. So the effectiveness was perceived to be strong and rated as strongly by all stakeholders. And you can see there is the graph across the different knowledge and understanding, the effectiveness of knowledge and understanding across the different research activity areas. And so the average was 3.9 out of 5. We rated everything, got everyone to rate out of 5. So that was deemed to be highly effective. Between the two stakeholder groups, there was a difference though. The research level stakeholders, so that's RDCs and research teams and research project partners, they rated the contribution to knowledge and understanding as high, while industry rated that more moderately. And industry stakeholders being growers and service providers. And I'll talk about that distinction a little bit as I go through. So the stakeholders, in their feedback, they recognise the contribution to knowledge across the three areas, and particularly they identified the contribution to addressing knowledge gaps in these areas, and particularly at the research level. Across most industries, the stakeholders commented that the research findings often confirmed or reinforced the existing knowledges or practices that they had and that they were undertaking. But those practices, those existing practices, had not been substantiated with research previously or substantiated with data. So they thought it was an important contribution that the program was able to validate those existing practices and provide confidence to industry on some of the things that they were already doing. There were, of course, areas that were new contributions to practices and processes. And for an example, there would be the mango industry, where previously there wasn't that research necessarily directly or specifically for the northern mango industry. So stakeholders thought that that was an important contribution for new knowledge in that area. EEFs generated the lowest rating barely across the three research activity areas, and the highest number of comments about the contribution to knowledge and understanding. Stakeholders thought that there had been a strong contribution to the interplay between EEFs and climate and soils, but that there was still a lot of uncertainty in that area with the different products and how those different factors relate. So that contributed to the slightly lower rating for knowledge and understanding across the stakeholders. So the other objective at the research level was supporting collaboration, research collaboration, and respondents rated that again highly for the MPfN activities contributing to that supporting that collaboration. So there was a 4 out of 5 rating for that. Stakeholders commented that they were particularly happy with the facilitation of inter and intra level collaboration, more on the within industry, intra-industry collaboration, but that also events like this one that we're at now, as well as the nitrogen natters, was really effective in providing an oversight of what other researchers and other industries were doing, and being able to generate thought on how that might apply to the different industries. So a small number of stakeholders did also comment on the collaboration side that perhaps more could have been done in the early planning stages to integrate the research, formally integrate the research objectives and synthesize the results across the industries. But in the case of the MPfN, This might have been limited by planning constraints or timing constraints at the planning stage, but certainly something to consider for future R&D for profit. And overall, as I said, these two research level objectives were considered to be highly effective. So moving on to the industry level objectives. So that's contributing to the extension, development of resources, extension, and changing that industry level knowledge and understanding. So the effectiveness against these three industry level objectives was rated by stakeholders as moderate, but it's important to think that think about this in the context of the primary objectives for the program. So this is consistent with those objectives being more of a secondary focus and really the focus going forward for the program outputs and the industries that have participated. Despite the lower ratings, stakeholders did recognise the positive contribution to the development of new and updated resources in the later stage of the program or as the next step for industries, as I've said. So the most positive comments and ratings within this came particularly from the dairy industry stakeholders, which I think reflects on the effective integration that they had in in integrating the research findings into industry resources, which I think Marguerite's already touched on these, the FERT-SMART guidelines, the NUE Pocket Guide, as well as the calculator was mentioned. So these generated a lot of positive comments for the dairy industry, and then that reflected back into the ratings for that industry. Cotton as well, the stakeholders did acknowledge the contribution of the findings to the Cotton Production Manual, which I think has just had a new edition put out, which is a key resource for industry. So it was effective in contributing to those industry level resources. With regards to extension, in-person activities were rated the highest across the various activities that the MPfN undertook. Stakeholders also identified the effectiveness of targeting service providers to generate that multiplier effect in getting the message out to industry, including collaborations with Fertiliser Australia. Demonstrating the economics was also highlighted as an important focus area for extension going forward to support producer confidence in the research and application of the research. And the importance of this, as Marguerite has mentioned, was recognised beforehand in the planning, and that's why we've completed multiple case studies for each industry to support that communication and extension going forward. Some stakeholders did feel that there hadn't been enough extension to effectively convey or reinforce the research findings, but this was higher amongst industry level stakeholders, so service providers and growers who that potentially reflects their reduced awareness that the primary focus was on the research objectives, but also that there has been a lot of work done in the later stages of the program, and this will be continued on by the industries going forward. Research level stakeholders, on the other hand, did recognise that the program delivered clear R&D outputs to inform those industry resources, being the primary objective, and responsibility then for integrating those into industry resources and then extending that to industry will continue beyond the end of the program. So it was recognised that it's only the beginning of the process, essentially. I think there were some good quotes throughout, which I've included at the bottom of the page as well, that it has been effective in delivering those outputs, and now the next step is to shift that across to industries to specifically integrate that into their resources and extension. So looking at the immediate and legacy impact next, we sought stakeholder feedback on the confidence of industry to adopt the findings as they were and the findings and recommendations from the research, potential barriers to adoption, and the expected impact areas that adoption would be expected to have. So stakeholders rated producer confidence to adopt as moderate. However, it's important to note at this point that the timeframe for practice change with agricultural R&D and R&D generally, I would say, is years or decades. So it's rare for industry adoption to occur rapidly after the completion of a program like MPfN or the underlying research. Rather, the adoption occurs in stages depending on a range of variables, being the effectiveness of extension and communication pathways, stakeholders' tolerance or appetite for risk and change, being sort of social aspects, as well as underlying market conditions, which was just talked about a minute ago. So relating to both the commodity as well as the technology or the innovation, in this case, urea prices and application. So a wide range of social and economic barriers were identified by the stakeholders. This generated the highest level of responses across the entire survey that we did. I've listed some of them, some of the primary barriers on the slide there, with the main one being that there's a perceived risk of missing out on loss on productivity, which was just mentioned, if you reduce your N application. And that combined with the relatively cheap nitrogen sources, being primarily urea, they support that culture where industries apply nitrogen as a form of cheap insurance. So these identified social and economic factors, they do present barriers to practice change for each of the industries, and it varies between each industry what the primary barriers are. But reducing, and these effectively reduce the rate or level of adoption going forward beyond the program. So understanding and addressing these barriers to change where possible and reinforcing the key research messages through industry-specific programs is critical to achieving that incremental adoption going forward, whether it's over years or decades. While this can be supported throughout the program, and I think Marguerite's already talked about the high level of outputs that have occurred throughout the MPfN in terms of communication and extension, more than 150% we identified of the planned activities were conducted. So that certainly contributes to industry's awareness of what the research is delivering. But ultimately, the success of that messaging and that extension depends on the final results being extended longer term and integrated into industry resources that are easy to use, easy to understand and apply, and centrally located. And that ultimately falls to industry research organisations and supporting industry bodies. Importantly, the stakeholders did recognise the significance of this ongoing process, and it was recognised particularly by research level stakeholders, and they did recognise that the MPfN has contributed to that process by setting up the individual industries with those new findings or validated findings. And promisingly, stakeholders have commented that first of all, that they've already identified adoption across all of the industries. So there is albeit a low level of adoption across the industries at this stage, but given the early stages of program, or since completion, that's positive. But also that as the extension continues, all industries were confident that there would be follow-on adoption of the findings and recommendations. So considering the above, what we found was in terms of the immediate and legacy impact, first of all, with the MPfN's strong contribution to generating that knowledge and understanding at the research level, combined with the identification of new strategies and resources or validated strategies, which are now available for inclusion in industry resources and in some cases have started. And finally, with the contribution, with confidence to adopt being moderate at this stage, but given the early stages of project completion, I would say that is a positive step or a positive to be taken away from this, that it's already moderate confidence with limited extension in some cases. So together we would say that we've said that there has been a strong immediate impact, particularly on that research area as fundamentally a research project. But more importantly, it has established a really strong foundation for future adoption, potential adoption of improved NUE practices. But importantly, as I've said, it's up to the individual research and extension bodies and supporting bodies to convert that potential into realised practice change that can generate economic and environmental impacts within the industry, and to achieve that by understanding some of those barriers at an industry level and targeting them where possible. And then finally, the only other point that I'll sort of say on the impact here is that just to touch on some of the key things that were identified already from adoption were the strong potential. Everyone was very confident that there was a 66% confidence rate that there would be strong outcomes in terms of profit from reduced nitrogen, increased yield or increased quality, or a combination of those, as well as then the environmental benefits were slightly less understood or less expected across researchers, but still in terms of less inputs leading to reduced environmental loss pathways of nitrogen with the associated benefits of reduced damage in that area. So with that, that sort of covers our final evaluation across the two different objective areas, the research and in industry level objectives, and the immediate and legacy impact. So overall, we did find that it had performed strongly in all those areas and should have a strong contribution going forward.